Half-Life was not only a critical and commercial success, but it was lauded as a game changer for first-person shooters. In the years following its release, the FPS landscape had already begun to change, transitioning away from level-to-level hallway shooters and focusing more on narrative and expansive worlds. This was due, in part, to Half-Life's influence, and it sowed the seeds for the modern FPS. But with success came demand for a sequel, and while Gearbox's expansions and fan mods were keeping Half-Life alive, it was clear to Valve what their next project would be: Half-Life 2. Little did the team realize, however, that their vision for a sequel would turn into one of the bumpiest rides of their careers. Development began in June 1999, with the team at Valve expanding to nearly triple its size by the time the game was eventually released. Valve co-founder Mike Harrington left the company in early 2000 and wouldn't return to the software industry until 2006. But Valve would bring in talent like software developer David Sparer, concept artist Zabi Eng, and Half-Life 2 art director Viktor Antonov, among many others. Gabe Newell was involved in the development, but he primarily focused on developing Steam, Valve's digital distribution platform that launched in 2003. The Half-Life 2 team generated concepts for a sequel set years after the original game, after a supreme alien force had taken over the world. The game would take place in a dark, industrial city inspired by Eastern European architecture surrounded by a post-apocalyptic landscape. However, the team knew soon after development began that they would need to create an entirely new engine to make their gameplay ideas come to life. So they created the Source engine, which all their future titles would be designed for. Source was created primarily to provide more realistic physics and facial animations, which Valve thought were necessary for their gameplay and story ideas. The team had an early build of Source running by 2001, and they created the first test levels later that year. Valve kept working on the game from there, with plans to create a demo to show off at E3 2002, but disappointment from the higher-ups at Valve on the finished demo shelved that plan. This was coupled on top of a lawsuit Valve initiated against their publisher Vivendi Universal over illegal distribution of Valve games to cybercafes, which wouldn't be settled until 2005. While this hurt the team, they continued to design the game's story, levels, and set pieces. The team had broken up into different groups called cabals, which would work on specific sections of the game and then bring them together in the final stages of development. Which was almost a necessity because the scope of the game was so large that it would have been a daunting challenge to approach development holistically. Valve announced that Half-Life 2 would launch on September 30th, 2003, despite internal concerns that development wasn't going fast enough to reach this deadline. They brought further hype to this announcement when they showed the game off at that year's E3 convention, which received overwhelming praise from those attending. That was in May 2003, however, and the game was due to be released in 3 months, so why was there no playable demo at the convention? The game appeared to be in a finished state, but there were rumors circulating that Valve was more behind in development than they were letting on. And as it turns out, that's exactly what was happening. While Valve continued to push the September release date to the press, the team knew that they needed much more time to finish the game. Valve is notorious nowadays for avoiding confirmations on specific deadlines for projects, but for Half-Life 2, they had the exact opposite problem. As September 30th crept closer, Newell kept stressing that the game would release on time, even when he knew it wouldn't happen. But they could only promise the impossible for so long, and the bubble had to burst at some point, and burst it did. Newell announced on September 23rd, exactly 1 week before Half-Life 2's supposed release date, that the game would be delayed, though he didn't say for how long. Fans were understandably outraged, with many proclaiming their anger at Valve and Newell for continuously lying to their faces, with some even calling for a boycott of their products. That would have been bad enough, but Valve's problems were far from over. In October, the Source engine's source code and a version of Half-Life 2 was leaked online. The leak contained a recent build of the game, a map pack containing every Half-Life 2 map Valve had created up to that point, and various assets from other Valve projects. It also contained the E3 demo files, which were revealed to have been scripted, even though Valve claimed they weren't. This leak, now known as the Half-Life 2 beta, was not only a massive blow to Valve, but it also confirmed to fans the scope of work on the game that was yet to be done. Many of the maps were either unfinished or unpolished, and it was clear that Valve was nowhere near finished making the game. There are a lot of differences between the beta and the final game, with the beta maps having a much darker, more depressing atmosphere than those in the retail release. We won't go into the beta content here because it deserves its own video, but I recommend looking into the beta if you want to see how Half-Life 2 changed over its development, either by playing the beta files yourself or by reading Half-Life 2 Raising the Bar, a book containing artwork, screenshots, and design documents from the game's development. Valve confirmed the leak was legitimate and that a then unknown party hacked their infrastructure, and Newell even asked the Half-Life fan community for help finding the culprit. The one responsible for cracking Valve's systems was eventually revealed to be Axel Gembe, a German hacker who was only 20 years old at the time of the hack. Gembe broke into Valve's internal network earlier that year in search of info on Half-Life 2. He had no malicious intent for doing so, he was just a Half-Life fan who wanted to learn more about the upcoming sequel. And when Valve apparently didn't notice his unauthorized presence on their system, he kept digging until he found the engine source code and game data. Several months after those files were leaked online, Gembe reached out to Newell himself and claimed responsibility for the hack. According to Gembe, he wanted to make some amends for what he had done, but was also interested in using the incident to land a job at the company. Gembe and Newell began corresponding, with Valve apparently willing to offer Gembe a position at Valve as a security professional. Newell invited Gembe to an in-person interview at their headquarters in Seattle, which Gembe was eager to accept. In reality, however, Valve was working with the FBI to bring Gembe down, and after receiving a confession that he hacked their servers, the FBI was ready to move in. The plan was for Gembe to fly to the United States courtesy of Valve, where the FBI would immediately arrest him. But when the German government caught wind of their plans, German police officers arrested Gembe instead. Gembe was put on trial in November 2006 for hacking Valve's network, where he admitted that he had indeed accessed Valve systems illegally and taken the files. Though he has always maintained that he was not responsible for leaking those files online, and the trial found no evidence to contradict his claim. Gembe received 2 years of probation for his actions, with the fairly light punishment thanks to his rough upbringing and work towards turning his life around. The total cost of the leak in damages to Valve was reported as $250 million, and adding the fan and media responses they were receiving, the team was absolutely demoralized. But to Valve's credit, they rallied, and they rallied hard. As 2004 came around, the majority of the gameplay and engine problems they faced were solved, so it was then a matter of assembling the game into a complete state. By the summer, they locked down the game's content, and by October, the game was finished. The fan resentment had died down, and once again, the gaming public was excited to play the sequel to their beloved Half-Life. Half-Life 2 was finally released for PC on November 16, 2004, and I don't need to tell you how successful the game was. The game received universal critical acclaim, with several publications listing it as their Game of the Year, and to this day, it continues to be called the greatest video game ever made. Half-Life 2's development was rough, no doubt about that, even when compared to Valve starting the first game's development over from scratch midway through. It's amazing to think that after the struggles Valve went through making the game and the fury they unleashed in their fanbase, they still put out a product that exceeded all expectations. That was 15 years ago, however, and it's time for me to revisit the sequel to one of my all-time favorite games and see if it's still deserving of its reputation. Is Half-Life 2 a worthy successor to the original, and does it hold up as a game on its own? Let's begin, as usual, with the game's plot. Half-Life 2 begins about 20 years after the events of Half-Life. Gordon Freeman is brought out of stasis by the G-Man and placed into City 17, a bleak, dismal-looking town located somewhere in Eastern Europe. City 17 is one of many human settlements that have been established where inhabitants are constantly watched over by the alien organization known as the Combine. The Combine are an alien race that invaded Earth after Gordon defeated the Nihilith, which led to an event known as the 7-Hour War, where, true to its name, humanity was so unprepared for the Combine that the aliens were able to defeat every military and civilian resistance effort in just 7 hours. The human race was spared, however, thanks to Dr. Wallace Breen, the former administrator of Black Mesa, negotiating humanity's surrender. Now humanity is suffering under the Combine, who have installed a massive superstructure known as the Citadel as their headquarters. which Gordon sees as he travels through City 17, witnessing the Combine's oppression and the citizens' depression and apathy. Gordon is almost sent to Nova Prospekt, a Combine prison, but he's rescued by Barney Calhoun, who's now working undercover in the Combine Civil Protection Division. Barney is a member of a resistance movement that's rebelling against the Combine, which conveniently is led mostly by former Black Mesa employees. Besides Barney, there's also Dr. Isaac Kleiner and Eli Vance, two of Gordon's fellow scientists whom Gordon worked with directly at Black Mesa. The Combine realizes that Gordon doesn't belong in City 17, and a group of officers corners him, but he's rescued by Alex Vance, Eli's daughter. Alex brings Gordon to Dr. Kleiner's lab, where he regains the HEV suit and sees their recently finished teleporter in action as it sends Alex to Eli's lab at Black Mesa East. Unfortunately, the teleporter fails when they try to send Gordon there, which alerts Dr. Breen to his presence and forces him to travel through the canals on the outskirts of City 17 to reach Eli. When Gordon reaches Black Mesa East, he meets Dr. Judith Mossman, another former Black Mesa employee who idolizes Eli but doesn't get along with Alex. Alex gives Gordon the gravity gun, an experimental machine that can grab heavy objects, but while he's testing it out, the Combine storm the lab, leaving Gordon to escape through the abandoned, zombie-infested city of Ravenholm. Thanks to assistance from Father Grigori, Gordon makes it through Ravenholm and ends up on the coastline, where he learns that Eli has been captured and taken to Nova Prospekt. Gordon drives up the antlion-infected coast and eventually reaches the Combine prison, meeting up with Alex inside. There, they discover that Mossman is a Combine spy and is responsible for Eli's imprisonment. Gordon and Alex confront Mossman and attempt to get Eli out of the facility, but Mossman teleports Eli and herself somewhere else while Alex is distracted. The Combine attempt to stop Alex and Gordon, but they teleport away just as Nova Prospekt begins to collapse from the unstable teleporter. The two arrive in Kleiner's lab, but they're shocked to learn that it took them over a week to teleport from the prison, even though it seemed like an instant to them. Since then, the citizens rose up against the Combine and turned City 17 into a war zone, and Eli has been taken to the Citadel. Gordon and Alex make their way towards the Citadel, but Alex is captured by the Combine, forcing Gordon to go alone. He assists Barney and the rest of the Resistance in fighting the Combine and their giant spider-like synths known as Striders. After a long stretch of battling Combine soldiers, Gordon infiltrates the Citadel, but he ends up in a security field that destroys all of his weapons. But it malfunctions on the gravity gun, causing it to become even more powerful and allow Gordon to grab and throw Combine soldiers. Gordon rides a pod to the top of the Citadel, where he discovers Mossman waiting for him, and since he can't release himself from his pod, he's now right in the Combine's hands. Breen is about to send Alex and Eli to a parallel universe, but Mossman betrays Breen, freeing everybody and sending Breen running off in a panic. Alex and Gordon give chase, reaching the dark energy reactor at the peak of the Citadel, which Breen is using to escape to another dimension. Gordon blows up the reactor, which apparently kills Breen and begins destroying the Citadel. Right before an explosion engulfs Gordon and Alex, however, the G-Man abruptly shows up to pluck Gordon to safety. The G-Man says he has other plans for Gordon, but refuses to go into specifics, and with that, he leaves Gordon in stasis once again, ending the game. Half-Life 2 places more emphasis on plot and dialogue than Half-Life, while also continuing the franchise's signature narrative design. Just looking at the plot on its own, it's more detailed than Half-Life's, with plenty of characters to meet and a carefully sequenced chain of events. While the story itself is fairly simple, it feels like a much larger adventure just because of the amount of detail the player is given. Valve desired to bring the story away from the resonance cascade and instead focus on its long-term consequences and what they mean for the characters you meet. Alex's relationship with both Gordon and her father are two of the biggest focal points of the story, and Valve developed them both very effectively. For a sizable chunk of the adventure, Alex is Gordon's companion, and since Gordon still doesn't speak, it feels more like she's talking to you as a player. You develop a real camaraderie with Alex through her connection with Gordon, which is undoubtedly a strong bond that may border on affection depending on your viewpoint. Alex and Eli's relationship is heartwarming and bittersweet in retrospect, and those of you who have played episode 2 know exactly why. In the context of Half-Life 2, Eli and his wife Asian were at Black Mesa with their young daughter Alex when the resonance cascade occurred. Asian unfortunately died in the aftermath, and Eli was forced to raise Alex in a desolate world under Combine rule. They share a loving father-daughter relationship, which is not a relationship you see represented that often in video games. Alex is more than capable of handling herself as an adult, and Eli recognizes this while still caring about her and making sure she's okay. He's never overbearing, a trope you associate with fathers raising a kid on their own. These two relationships will be more developed in the Half-Life 2 episodes, but even without them, Alex manages to stand out as a companion to the player. Then there's Dr. Breen, one of my favorite video game antagonists. You don't meet him face to face until the very end, but you feel his presence all throughout the game, usually in the form of Combine propaganda. In particular, the Breencast, televised messages where Breen addresses the residents of City-17, the Resistance, and sometimes Gordon himself about the glory of the Combine.
Tell me, Dr. Breen, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing? I thought not.
Breen's dialogue is fabulously written, showing that he is an intelligent man and a forceful ruler while making it clear that he's still a villain. You can argue that Breen is responsible for humanity's survival, since without his intervention, the Combine would have enslaved the human race and destroyed the Earth. But it's clear that he has his own ulterior motives for allying with the Combine and has a lust for power now that he's in charge of the entire species. And that power isn't just implied either. Apart from being the supreme ruler of humanity, he hints that he's well aware of the G-Man and his connection to Gordon. Though we don't know the nature of Breen's own relationship with the G-Man and just how much influence Breen had over the resonance cascade and its aftermath. While the Combine themselves are the true enemy of Half-Life 2, Breen is perhaps the most intriguing character, as he represents both humanity's survival and ruin. Throughout the game, you'll also encounter several citizens and resistance members who will tell you where to go, give you supplies, or offer to lend a hand. And occasionally you'll even run across a Vortigaunt, who became friendly after Gordon freed them from the enslavement of the Nihilith and are now allies of the Resistance. There's a lot of these auxiliary characters to chat with in the game, which makes it all the more noticeable that Valve only hired 2 voice actors for most of the minor cast. John Patrick Lowry, also the voice of the sniper in Team Fortress 2, and Mary Kay Irvin, who did voice work for Halo 3, voiced the citizens, and while their performances are fine, it's pretty obvious that they're just talking to themselves.
This is how it always starts. First the building, then the whole block. They have no reason to come to our place. Don't worry, they'll find one.
Now, to be fair, this was a problem in Half-Life as well, as Harry S. Robbins and Mike Shapiro were the only voice actors for the Black Mesa scientists and security guards. But with the greater emphasis on story in Half-Life 2, it's definitely a bigger problem here. I know I might get some flack for saying this, but Half-Life 2's narrative is, in all honesty, a significant downgrade from Half-Life's. The game employs many of the same storytelling techniques, and control is still never taken away from the player during plot moments. But because Valve created a larger and more intricate plot, they had to adjust their narrative design to compensate, and most of those adjustments weren't for the better. There's a lot more exposition this time around, not just explaining what happened in the years following the events of Half-Life, but also informing the player of the current situation. Which did happen in the original game, but with more characters this time around, it's much more noticeable here. And a lot of this exposition is forced onto the player, as the game stops in its tracks at several points to advance the story. You're still able to look and move around most of the time, but many story sequences lock the player in a set room or location while characters say what they need to say. That's absolutely fine the first time around, but on repeated playthroughs you'll desperately wander around the room looking for something to occupy you. Personally, I don't find myself bothered too much by these instances railroading the player, but I know that not everybody is patient enough to deal with all the stop-and-go action. However, something I can't look past, especially after playing the game for so long, are the numerous retcons. Retconning is always a tricky subject because if it's done poorly, or for no reason, it can subtract from the narrative rather than add to it. In Half-Life 2, retcons are the basis for essentially all of the game's characters. Dr. Kleiner, for example, was a character mentioned in Half-Life's manual and in Half-Life Decay as Gordon Freeman's professor and supervisor, but we never saw him until Half-Life 2. While he's essentially a composite character that represents the entire Black Mesa scientist team, specifically drawing his appearance from the Glasses model, in Half-Life 2 he's apparently a full-fledged separate character who Gordon knows well. Barney, who we last quote-unquote saw in Blue Shift, is a similar case, as he represents the Black Mesa security guards but is his own distinct character. He's since upgraded from his original mute status, gaining a personality and voice, but again, we're supposed to treat him as somebody whom we've known all this time. In Half-Life, the Black Mesa team occasionally referred to a figure known as the Administrator, the big boss of the complex, and in Half-Life 2, this is confirmed to be Dr. Breen. Which almost seems too convenient for the plot, giving the nameless Black Mesa Administrator a face to appease Half-Life players and justify a retcon. The worst of it is Eli, who's the only character that directly states that he interacted with Gordon during the events of Half-Life. His character is based off the Black Scientist model, but there are a number of them in Half-Life and none of them are referred to as Eli, so which one is he? It's this one. This one right here. This is Eli. It's worth noting that earlier in Half-Life 2's development, these characters either didn't exist or were entirely different people that Valve retooled into their current form. I guess they made these changes to tie the game closer to its predecessor, but it feels forced more than anything, and it leads to another problem. All these characters treat Gordon as if he were the greatest human being ever, all because he was the one responsible for defeating the Nihilynth. And that kind of ruins Gordon's character for me, because one of the things that made him interesting was that he was just an ordinary guy. He wasn't the badass action hero the Resistance makes him out to be, he was just a physicist, a lab assistant who was thrust into an extraordinary situation. It's incredible that Gordon managed to survive the events of Half-Life, yes, but without the assistance of the G-Man, Gordon likely would have died. Maybe that was the point though, showing how those who have no knowledge of the G-Man's interference react to his miraculous survival. There's no doubt that Gordon is a hero, but Valve spread his reputation on a bit too thick. It feels like Valve tried too hard to appeal to fans of the first game, especially when it comes to all the snide in-jokes and references. Half-Life 2 loves rubbing in quick callbacks to Half-Life, and while they're amusing the first time you play, they've become distracting after all these years. For example, one of the things Barney talks about is him owing Gordon a beer, referencing a line that security guards could say in Half-Life.
Hey, catch me later, I'll buy you a beer.
Some of these in-jokes work okay, and maybe you find them charming, but I guess I've gotten sick of them after all this time. Half-Life 2's story is still very enjoyable, even if the storytelling has taken a hit, because the characters and writing are, for the most part, excellent, and the world you travel in is engaging. I just think that on the whole, Half-Life had the more immersive narrative experience. With that said, let's move on to the gameplay and see how Valve continued to revolutionize the first-person shooter genre. Half-Life 2 refined Half-Life's gameplay while bringing in some new features and a brand new engine, which of course Valve shows off to the fullest effect. Gordon isn't quite as slippery to control this time around and walks at a brisk pace by default, but you can also sprint if you need some extra speed to dodge attacks or jump large gaps. Combat still relies heavily on movement, and the smoother controls are easier to get used to. You can now grab and hold onto objects assuming they're light enough to carry, and you can throw them around, which isn't that useful, but is always fun to do when NPCs are talking. There's also the squad system, expanding on the follower mechanic from the Half-Life games. Up to 4 Resistance members will follow you around, and you can order them to move to specific locations, adding some real-time strategy elements to the mix. But I don't find it very practical in dire situations, and this system only appears in 2 chapters, so just as you're getting the hang of it, it's taken away from you. Half-Life 2 also introduces vehicle gameplay, with Gordon traversing certain areas in both an airboat and a scout car. These vehicles handle decently enough on their own, but thanks to the rough terrain you'll be driving through, you never feel like you're fully in control while driving. The weapon selection isn't nearly as large this time around, with only the crowbar, pistol, revolver, submachine gun, shotgun, grenades, crossbow, and RPG returning. They all act more or less as they did in Half-Life, though most have had their looks updated to reflect the game's art direction. Many weapons are now based on entirely different guns than their Half-Life counterpart. For instance, Half-Life's pistol was a Glock 17, while Half-Life 2's is a USP match. And the crossbow now looks like a jerry-rigged weapon rather than one professionally made, which I really like since I'm a fan aesthetically of DIY weapons made from scrap. The crossbow now also shoots heated rebar rather than bolts, which can stick an enemy's corpse to surfaces if you aim it right, because physics. As for new weapons, the pulse rifle is an assault rifle which is pretty damaging on its own, but it has a secondary fire that shoots a ball of energy that bounces off of surfaces and vaporizes anybody it touches. The bug bait allows you to control antlions and have them attack specific targets. If you hit a Combine soldier with bug bait, they'll be momentarily stunned, allowing you and your antlion buddies to take them down with ease. But the biggest new weapon is the Gravity Gun, properly known as the Zero-Point Energy Field Manipulator, which is awesome. With the Gravity Gun, you can grab objects from afar and launch them, which is great for both clearing the path around you and for tossing heavy stuff at enemies. It's definitely the most iconic addition to Half-Life 2, and while I do get tired of using it in the endgame where it's your only option, it's incredibly fun to use elsewhere. Gordon will face up against both Xen and Combine aliens this time around, and while there's no HECU to deal with, you'll still need to be on your guard. Headcrabs, zombies, and barnacles return, and there's two new variations of zombies that result from their respective headcrabs. The fast zombies, true to their name, are fast, lunging at the player and climbing up surfaces. And the poison zombies throw poison headcrabs at Gordon, which bring Gordon's health down to 1, then gradually restores it. The fast zombies aren't too annoying to deal with, even if they are frightening, but poison zombies take so much damage to kill. They do die on their own after releasing all their headcrabs, but trying to get rid of them quickly is just frustrating. The only new non-Combine aliens are the antlions, which burrow themselves in the sand along the coastline and attack Gordon in herds. As I said, once Gordon gains the bug bait, he can control the antlions and use them against the Combine, which is actually fairly effective thanks to the antlions infinitely respawning. Though antlions show up for such a small amount of time that it almost seems like a waste. This doesn't work on the antlion guards, however, these giant beasts that will charge at the player and deal massive damage, and also have a lot of health. The main enemies are the Combine, who range from genetically modified humans to aliens with heavy synthetic upgrades. Most of the Combine you'll face are the various Combine soldiers, who are essentially the replacement for the HECU. There are a few types of soldiers: Civil Protection or Metro Cops, Overwatch soldiers, and Overwatch Elite, all of whom have more offense and defense than the last. Like the HECU, you almost always encounter Combine soldiers in groups, and they'll employ tactics like flanking, covering fire, and grenades to keep you on your toes. Soldiers will often be aided by mechanical hazards as well, such as the Manhacks, these flying robots that will tear Gordon to shreds if they touch him. The city scanners take pictures of Gordon and will blind him momentarily if he's looking straight at them, and when City 17 becomes a war zone, they get upgraded to drop hopper mines. These mines latch into the ground, then jump up and explode once you're in range, but with the gravity gun you can uproot them and use them yourself. While you're driving the scout car, you'll occasionally have to deal with roller mines that interfere with your steering, forcing you to destroy them or punt them into the ocean. Beyond this, the Combine also has heavier artillery that Gordon will need to face. The Hunter Chopper and Gunship will fly around and shoot at you in burst, and they can take out a huge chunk of your health in an instant. They can't be damaged by normal firearms, meaning you need to use either the airboat's mounted gun or an RPG to bring them down. Finally, there's the biggest and meanest enemy of them all, the Spiders. That's not their name, the Striders. These towering spider synths are also immune to smaller weapons, and they have both a pulse cannon and devastating warp cannon that destroys a small radius. It takes a lot of firepower to destroy them, and sometimes they'll deploy scanners if you're hiding behind cover and they can't find you. While I don't find the Combine quite as memorable as the Xen aliens, they definitely require a lot more tactical planning, which can make for more intense combat. Gordon can't carry as much ammo as in Half-Life, but once again there are ammo and health caches lying around so you can restock. Resource management is still a major aspect of combat because recharge stations are few and far between and ammo crates can only get you so far. However, once you get the gravity gun, the game's combat opens up quite a bit, as you're able to use physics props to damage enemies. One of the many ways Valve implemented their physics engine into the game's design. Source's physics engine, a modified version of the Havok engine, is still pretty solid. It goes well beyond what Gold Source could do, like for instance replacing Half-Life's depth animations with ragdoll physics, something I never get tired of seeing. Half-Life 2 wasn't the first game to feature a robust physics system, or the first to make physics a fundamental aspect of gameplay. But Valve put in a lot of work to make the physics realistic while ensuring that every detail benefited the gameplay in some way. Most of the puzzles are physics-based, requiring you to manipulate objects in a manner that will open the way forward. Every object has its own defined weight to it, so objects that you naturally expect to be heavier will be heavier. But this extends to other properties as well. For instance, some objects will break if they collide with something at a certain force, and others won't. Materials like wood and glass are more fragile than metals and rocks, as in real life, but that doesn't make those objects any less valuable in combat. It just means you need to survey the area to find props that will last under pressure. Valve really wanted you to be able to use the gravity gun in firefights, so combat encounters will usually take place in a room with plenty of physics objects. It probably isn't possible to beat the entire game using only the gravity gun, but you can get a surprising amount of use out of it. But beyond the physics engine, the core game design hasn't changed much since Half-Life. Levels still transition seamlessly between each other, and the maps are still very linear, but the areas are larger and more open than Half-Life's. This sometimes makes it difficult to know exactly where to go, especially in Ravenholm, whose layout is still confusing to me even to this day. And in Nova Prospekt, where every location looks too identical to each other. You'll sometimes have an NPC leading you around, which eliminates this issue, but when you're alone, you may find yourself getting lost. Gordon will occasionally be accompanied by another character as he makes his way through each level, and they'll help you by killing enemies and opening locked doors and gates. This will either be a character like Alex, or one of the many Resistance members you meet. While Resistance members are basically expendable, it's almost impossible for important NPCs to die during combat, so they won't cause you to get a game over. Half-Life 2 is on the whole a well-designed shooter, but there's something in me that feels like the game structure is too much like a tech demo. Many chapters serve as ways to introduce or show off gameplay elements to the player. Water Hazard has the airboat, Ravenholm has the gravity gun, Highway 17 has the scout car, Nova Prospekt has antlions, and so on. It does sometimes seem like Valve designed these areas more from a technical perspective to best show off their gameplay over designing them to be the most fun. That's not to say that these levels aren't fun, because they are. I just can't shake the feeling that the map design didn't focus enough on the right aspects. Not to mention, some of the gameplay choices Valve made are questionable to say the least. In addition to having an armor meter, your HEV suit now also has an energy meter, which depletes if you perform certain actions. Sprinting, using your flashlight, and holding your breath underwater all consume energy, and if your suit runs out, you need to wait for it to recharge. I can understand why sprinting and holding your breath would require the same energy bar, since they're both physical tasks that require endurance, but what about Gordon's flashlight? It makes no sense for Gordon's flashlight to prevent his ability to run faster or avoid drowning. This wouldn't be a big issue if it weren't for the higher contrast making dark tunnels and caves incredibly difficult to see in, facilitating a constant need for the flashlight. Then there's the driving chapters, which are the worst in the game, not only because of the sometimes aggravating vehicle controls, but because the maps are mostly empty space. There are long stretches of road in these levels with maybe some pretty scenery, but otherwise nothing to keep the player engaged between areas of interest. My favorite part of the scout car chapter is traveling underneath the bridge, not just because it's an iconic location with a breathtaking view, but also because you aren't driving the car. Speaking of the view, Half-Life 2 is graphically quite a step up from Half-Life, thanks to the advanced visual capabilities of Source. Unlike the original, which wasn't the best looking game when it came out and certainly looks incredibly dated now, Half-Life 2 remains a game that's very nice to look at. One of the tenets that Valve set forth with Half-Life 2 was that they needed realistic models and locations in order to tell a more emotional, believable story. To that end, models have much more polish, and Source's light and shadow rendering creates dark, foreboding environments. Rather than jagged, polygonal models flapping their jaws, facial models are fully lip-synced, allowing dialogue to look more natural. The animations were all created manually without the aid of motion capture, and they still look pretty good even if they are a little bit stiff. Half-Life 2 has a more diverse range of settings, with more outdoor areas and fewer buildings. While Black Mesa took place in one huge location, Half-Life 2 constantly shifts through different environments, with factors like the time of day and textures changing accordingly. One minute you're traveling through the muddy canals at sunset, the next you're in the dingy streets of Ravenholm at night. It helps make each chapter memorable, and shows just how large of a world you travel through, and if there's one aspect of Half-Life 2 that hasn't aged one bit, it's the atmosphere. Half-Life 2 is drenched in a dark, somber atmosphere that's equally beautiful and depressing. There's less of a horror emphasis, instead providing a dreary, solemn mood that perfectly encapsulates the idea of a world taken over by oppressive alien overlords. There's a lot of emphasis on muted colors, grays, and browns, as well as environments that are in disrepair or have been completely destroyed, which is accentuated by the use of dynamic lighting to give each area its own look and feel to it. Valve also improved the game's sound design to create a distinct ambience for every location you visit, which contributes to the atmosphere as well. The background noise and environmental sounds further establish the state of Half-Life 2's world as it evolves over the course of the adventure. During combat and action sequences, the multi-directional audio and punchy sound effects completely absorb you into the game. And even though future games reuse these sound effects as they become the default for Source games, I never get sick of them. However, I can't extend the same praise to the music, and in this case it isn't the soundtrack itself, but rather how it's used. Half-Life 2's music was once again composed by Kelly Bailey, and if we look at the music on its own, it's still really good, probably the best in the series. The soundtrack is much more focused in terms of genre, being comprised mostly of electronica songs and ambient pieces, which fit well in the industrial and urban landscapes. There's an appropriately sci-fi edge to each track, and while the soundtrack isn't gloomy as a whole, it does tend to fall on the darker side, with slower tempos and melodies in lower octaves. Bailey incorporates soundscapes and effects into many of these pieces as well, in order to highlight the tone of both the music and locations they play in. This is the soundtrack that defines Half-Life for me. It encompasses many different moods and dynamics while also creating a sound that's unique to the series. It represents how much Bailey's musical style has evolved since Half-Life, and as I said, it might just be the best soundtrack in the franchise. The problem is that in-game, the soundtrack is overused to the point of aggravation. Half-Life knew exactly when to play music and when to keep things silent, and it gave instances where music did play a much greater impact. But in Half-Life 2, there are music cues in almost every single map, and while many of them add to the moment, some of them just feel unnecessary or distracting. Many of the tracks are used multiple times, so you can't necessarily tie a piece to one specific moment, which is what helped make the Half-Life soundtrack so memorable. There's even a situation where the same song plays twice in the same chapter, with both instances happening maybe 20 minutes apart. I won't say it ruins the soundtrack in the context of the game, but it's something you'll definitely notice if you're paying attention. Half-Life 2 also reuses several songs from Half-Life's soundtrack, which for the same reasons don't have the effect that I think was intended. I can't think about how these tracks add to Half-Life 2's story and setting because all they do is remind me of events from the original Half-Life. Maybe that's me being nitpicky, but it feels odd seeing Valve taking steps back in how they implement the soundtrack. At its core, Half-Life 2 is still an excellent shooter with some brilliant design and a story and setting that still resonate with me. It touched up Half-Life's base gameplay in all the right places while still maintaining an emphasis on solid, intelligent game design. And most of the features added thanks to the capabilities of the Source engine are amazing. Not only that, but the plot, characters, visuals, and world building still hold up tremendously well, and they feel notably divergent from Half-Life while not completely distancing themselves from it. However, many narrative techniques work against the story, and some design choices range from mediocre to awful, especially as the game continues to age. And compared to Half-Life, I'm not gonna lie, I think it's a step down. Half-Life has its problems, and yes, it is dated in many ways, but it still remains a conceptually and fundamentally sound game on almost all accounts. Whereas Half-Life 2 sometimes feels constricted by its own design, which leads to portions of the game falling apart at the seams under scrutiny. It often feels like a game that was rushed so that players could finally experience it, and that's supported by the development history. I still love Half-Life 2, and it's a great starting point if you want to try the Half-Life series out. You don't need to know anything about Half-Life to understand it, and since it's closer to how modern shooters feel and control, it's easier to adjust to. But while it's a fantastic game on its own accord, it just doesn't fully work as a sequel. A lot of that is probably my own bias, since I love the original Half-Life to death, and hey, if you prefer Half-Life 2, that's perfectly okay. And I can't deny how influential Half-Life 2 was to the video games that followed it. Not only is Half-Life 2 a beloved title and considered one of the greatest games ever made, but it, alongside the first game, left an impact on gaming that has not faded over time. Half-Life helped introduce players to concepts like continuous narrative, gameplay and story integration, and environmental storytelling, and Half-Life 2 helped to codify those concepts. But Half-Life 2 was also a watershed in the use of real-time physics in video games as a means to demonstrate complex plot points and act as a core feature of gameplay. What Valve managed to pull off despite the incredibly rough development and initial pushback from fans was astounding, especially considering the content that followed. While Half-Life 2 didn't ship with any multiplayer content at launch, Valve released Half-Life 2 Deathmatch as a standalone title just a few weeks after the game came out. It featured specially designed deathmatch maps that took advantage of the physics-based combat, with plenty of objects laid about that you can launch at opponents with the gravity gun. There aren't a lot of active players nowadays, but if you like Half-Life 2, and you like deathmatch, and you have a couple of people to play with, it's definitely worth trying. In 2005, Valve released Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, a level that serves as a tech demo for new features Valve pushed to the Source engine. Namely the addition of high dynamic range rendering, which adds features like bloom shading to create more realistic lighting. The level also contains audio commentary from Valve employees exploring how the HDR rendering was designed and how the level was created to show it off. As for the level itself, it's a self-contained map taking place in the coastal town of St. Olga, where Gordon is tasked by a fisherman to disable Combine artillery strikes that are being launched from an abandoned monastery. It's not a long map, and it is essentially just a tech demo, but the HDR rendering does look very nice, and it is cool to just have another Half-Life 2 level to play. This was followed by Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Half-Life 2 Episode 2, which directly continue the story and introduce brand new locations and characters. Valve believed that episodic gaming was the perfect fit for a continuation of Half-Life 2, as they could crank out a handful of shorter titles that would comprise one large-scale adventure. Since they already had the base gameplay and engine finished, it would take a significantly shorter amount of time to design new content. In addition, Valve developed games for other franchises using the Source engine, including Portal, Team Fortress 2, Left 4 Dead, and Counter-Strike Global Offensive, proving just how long-lasting the Source engine is, especially considering it's still being used in high-profile releases today, like Titanfall 2. Half-Life 2 was later re-released alongside the episodes TF2 and Portal in the Orange Box collection, which launched on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in 2007. There was also a version of Half-Life 2 that was exclusive to Japanese arcades called Half-Life 2 Survivor, developed by Taito Corporation and released in 2006. The cabinet features two joysticks, one on each side of the armrest, which controls moving and shooting, and two foot pedals for jumping and crouching. The main campaign is more or less the same, with some maps and content trimmed out, much fewer story elements, and a completely different UI. This version also contains a battle mode where up to 8 players compete, either locally or online via networked machines, in a 4v4 team deathmatch. I can't exactly judge without playing an actual cabinet myself, but I can imagine that this version is probably awkward to play, and certainly not the best way to play Half-Life 2. And once again, Half-Life 2 has an active modding scene, and fans have produced several noteworthy mods and total conversions. Thanks to Steam and Valve's ardent support for fan-created content, modders now had a platform with which they could launch and distribute their mods. And to this day, you can download a number of Half-Life 2 mods directly from Steam. Some mods focus on improving the base Half-Life 2 experience, such as Half-Life 2 Update, which tightens up the graphics with improved lighting and shadows, as well as fixing some bugs. Others attempt to overhaul the entire look of the game, such as the infamous Cinematic mod, which changes character models, adds new objects and decals, cranks the bloom levels up way too high, and contains several vulgar references that are just laughably out of place. While it does look better in some areas, a lot of the visual updates are more distracting than they should be, not to mention inconsistencies between the new graphics. For a better example, there's also Half-Life 2 M-Mod, which adds new animations, lighting, VFX, and sounds that feels like a genuine HD remaster. Unlike Cinematic Mod, which tries too hard to turn Half-Life 2 into its own thing, M-Mod touches up the game in various ways while staying true to the original. It's a perfect representation of how fans can build upon the source material and make it better without changing the core aspect of what that material is. Of course, there's plenty of other mods that provide brand new content. Some of the most famous include the Stanley Parable, Dear Esther, No More Room in Hell, Age of Chivalry, and Fistful of Frags, all of which eventually became standalone releases. These mods typically rely heavily on either immersive narrative design or a full-fledged PvP multiplayer experience, which Valve's own games are known for. The Half-Life modding community is one of the greatest I've ever seen, and it's inspiring seeing these fan creations eventually spin off into their own projects. Half-Life 2 was another critical and commercial juggernaut, allowing Valve to triumph over the rocky development and ill will they had generated before its release. However, Valve wasn't done with Half-Life 2's universe just yet, as the next titles from them would continue the game's story and flesh out the characters even more. And they would ultimately lead to over a decade of agonizing waiting for the fans.